Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to one and all. I'm Andy Smith, chair at the SFSA. Another year of progress, more members. We've got more insight from those members. Imagine a football organization who asks its stakeholders what they actually think about things. And the other thing, membership will always be free. We have more influence. Somebody said something nice about us. The SFSA are a voice of insight, reason, and balance. We have a new CEO, Stuart Murphy, who you'll see later. And before introducing our panel guest, let's just look at a couple of things. Fans will never agree 100% about anything, but we can come to consensus, and we value common good over self-interest when we sit round the table. We see the bigger picture. We value our communities with a passion. Football in Scotland needs a reset button. We need a common good over self-interest restart. The teams at the top, maybe their leagues too, are probably lost to the money, power, money quicksands. All over the world that's happening, and Scotland will not be immune. There has to be a reform of the game in Scotland, and that's what today we're talking about. We've got 5 panelists, and let me briefly introduce them, and our chairman, Heather. We have Ian Murray, all-round good guy, football fan, thinker, with the ability to get things done. We've Kevin Miles, the Football Supporters Association CEO. He's a football fan. He's fighting the same fight we are. He's further down the road and he's got the bruises that show it. We've got Craig Brown as our special guest today. A legend. He's been there, he's done it. A football fan too. Huge football bandwidth, humanity, insight, and he still has a kilt. I got him in 1998, although he said he had to give it to his son. We have Simon Barrow, the SFSA co-founder. He has a deep understanding of politics in Scotland and how it works. Football needs political help. If you slice Simon's arm, like a stick of rock, you'll read Dumbarton. And finally, we have Henry McLeish, ex-footballer, Leeds United, and that team in Fife, East Fife. He's a football fan. He's a leader. He's a writer of reports that are in the long grass, either behind the North Stand or the South Stand at Hampden. He is passionate about youth football and football communities. That's 5 people who are here because they want to give something back. And finally, our chair today is Heather Dewar, well-known broadcaster. She needs no introduction, and we are really lucky that Heather will take this from now. I'll come back later, but over now to Heather.
Well, thank you very much to you, Andy. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the Scottish Football Supporters Association Annual Conference. Great to have you here today. Hopefully, next time around, we will get a chance to see you all in flesh. But for now, as I say, great to have you here, and we thank you all in advance for your participation. So today, what's it all about? Well, it's about engagement. We want to hear your views because that's what we're all about, and get a sense of what is important to you, while also detailing our hopes and our plans for the game in Scotland. Now, we do have a chat function available this afternoon, so if you want to put any questions across to our panel, please just put them in the chat. I'm sure most of you will know what to do by now. We've had a couple of years of Zoom, and I will do my best to get all those questions to the panelists. And if you want to remain anonymous, that happens a lot, that's cool. You can do so, no problem. Just put anonymous at the top of your chat message, and I'll make sure I don't read out your names. If you want to ask a question, you do want to be named, that's absolutely fine as well. But please do ask if you have a question. We have a fantastic panel, as I said. They want to hear your views too. They want to hear your questions. We're very happy indeed to answer your queries. So shall we see who they are? Well, thank you, Andy. You've detailed some of them briefly, but it is a sterling panel this afternoon. We're joined by Ian Murray MP, a Scottish politician who served as Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland since 2020, a very strong advocate for the reform of the game in Scotland, previously chairman of the Foundation of Hearts, the fan ownership model that owns Heart of Midlothian. And he's also been a supporter of the SFSA since our launch in 2015. Kevin Miles is the CEO of our sister organisation, organisation, the FSA, the Football Supporters Association. He's been involved in fan affairs for over 20 years. So really looking forward to hearing what Kevin has to say. He's also a board director of Football Supporters Europe, and he was a key advisor on the fan-led review of the game in England. This man needs absolutely no introduction. Craig Brown, I want to know what the state of that kilt is that Andy was talking about. Craig, a former player, school teacher, famously known as a football coach, of course. He excelled there with the various age groups of the national team before becoming the national team manager and guiding Scotland to their last World Cup in France, 1998. And Craig will never hear the end of that until they do it again. He is a current non-executive director and ambassador of Aberdeen Football Club too. We then have Henry McLeish, again, a man who probably needs no introduction, a former Leeds United and East Fife player who became a politician, rising to the position of First Minister. And his passion has always been for football and, of course, his beloved East Fife. Now, he's authored 2 reports for the SFA on the Scottish game, as well as a report on football and the communities for the Scottish Football League. He was also a founding director for the SFSA. Simon Barrow, finally, director of the think tank Ecclesia, which looks at how beliefs and values intersect with politics and society. And Simon has been very active in journalism, in politics, and indeed in adult education for many years. He is a very passionate Dumbarton fan, and he just noted it there, cut his arm and he bleeds Dumbarton blood, I think. He's a passionate supporter then, and was an associate director and media officer for the club from 2018 to 2020. He also follows the national team and is a co-founder of the SFSA. So I think you will all agree, a brilliant panel in store for you today, and we thank you all in advance for your participation. So without further ado, I'm not going to speak anymore for this, because I think that I want to hear, and I'm sure you all want to hear from the panelists themselves. They've got some really interesting things to tell you today. So let's take an in-depth look, shall we, at the need for a review of the game in Scotland. We've already heard some of that from Andy. Let's welcome on first then, Henry McLeish.
Well, thanks very much, Heather, and thank you for all the good supporters who are listening today. The important thing about all of us being together is that we love the game with a passion. We love its ups, we love its downs, and of course, in certain areas we've had a lot of downs. On the other hand, you know, I was delighted to see that we had European success in getting to a final, and we didn't quite make the World Cup, and obviously that is a great issue for Scots generally. But I'd like very briefly to talk about 2 or 3 issues that interest me. First of all, I think it's important to say that the SFSA have created what we call a football alliance. This is designed to involve people with expertise, experience of the game, to come together, look at the game's problems, look at the game's strengths, and try and chart a way forward. It is hoped that that will happen in terms of publication, maybe later on this year, early next year. But in that report, we will look at the wisdom we've received from many, many people, because, you know, the game shouldn't be unique to floor 6 at Hampden Park, Glasgow, where we have the Scottish Premier League, the SFA, who are working towards both the national game and the club game. I think it's vitally important that there is a wider canvas of people involved, because nobody has a unique idea of where Scottish football should be going. But I think every organisation, including the Scottish Professional Football Association, should appreciate there is wisdom to be tapped into. And I'm just concerned there is a narrow stream of wisdom currently available to the game. I think the second point is that we're all conscious that we have the club game, and every weekend, you know, supporters will go and support their clubs. That's excellent. We have a good reputation and all of that. But I know that for 5.6 million Scots, a more important thing is how the national team performs on the world stage. And of course, in that, we're disappointed. For nearly a quarter of a century, we haven't qualified. And we're delighted to see Craig Brown here, who is a winner in getting us to that important national platform. That said, I believe that when I look at Croatia, 4 million people, Denmark, same population as Scotland, why can they be there most years? And then recently, Croatia can get to a World Cup final when we can't get to World Cup finals. It seems to me that there is something fundamentally wrong in what we're doing. Not easy to address, but I think that involves the governance of the game. In the Scottish game just now, there is a professional game board. I believe we should have an international game board. So the ambition for the national side could be its highest. We should be working with both sexes and, of course, every age group to make sure that at every level, this great footballing country with great memories and great history can once again show what we're worth. I think it's also important, as part of that, we involve ourselves in developing the youth game. I am so disappointed that after the report that I prepared some years ago, when we recommended an all Scotland-wide academy structure, we have no Scotland-wide academy structure. All we have now is club structures. That doesn't mean to say that the clubs don't need to bring on young people. But as far as the national priority is concerned, we need a wider scope to get talent from Stranraer to the Shetlands. Scotland has an abundance of talent. My belief is we're not quite getting through to look at that, find it, nurture it, develop it, and see it perform at Hampden and on the world stage generally. So I believe that Project Brave, which was to encapsulate what I suggested, has been dismantled. I find that sad. And we find that of the 42 clubs who are professional and semi-professional, 22 of them now have no part to play in that academy structure that was suggested. I also think, finally, that the governance of the game is really quite important. The governance of the game might be a bit remote for our devoted supporters who want to see their team play, they want to see their team win, they want to see success. But I think the governance of the game matters to all of us, because essentially this is how the game runs. This is how we get information into the game. This is how we develop the game. This is how we learn from others. Kevin Miles is here from down south. It's very important that we do learn. So in terms of the governance of the game, why is it we seem to be disinterested in taking on ideas? And in that case, all we're seeing is really a repeat. And I make a point, and it seems a simplistic, highly simplistic point that I'm making, that for a quarter of a century, we haven't qualified. Now, we in the Alliance, we in the SFSA, we on this panel are saying, why not? Why have we not made it when other countries can do so? I firmly believe that we need a bigger ambition at Hampden. We need a well-developed elite program. We need a youth pathway that takes young players further in the game, or if not, then towards a good education and remaining an interest in the national side. And I also believe that if we want to see the game go forward, let's use the talent of Scotland. Let's use the Craig Browns. Let's lose the influence and potential efforts of people like Ian Murray. You know, we're a country rich in talent, rich in ideas, rich in ambition, but currently we don't see that happening on the game. So hopefully the Alliance report will take that forward. And I would like to think that all the supporters who are listening in today will want to be part of improving the game, you know, because I just do think, now I remember, and I'll finish on this point, we played Italy some years ago now in a World Cup qualifier at Hampden. Scotland closed down in the morning of that game. There was nothing open. The game gripped the country. The country wanted success. Of course, as most people will remember, the Italians scored early and we were out the World Cup. But that said, the national game matters. And I think the pride, there's national pride that's involved, should be taking us further than we are. But Hampden, SPFA plus SFA, we need more identity, more ambition. And if we get that, we can all work together for a better conclusion as we approach 2026. Thanks very much, Heather.
Fantastic stuff. Thanks so much indeed to Henry McLeish there, and particularly pertinent with where Scotland are at the moment following the World Cup qualifiers. Let's head over to Simon Barrow then, shall we, for more on the Scottish Football Alliance. Simon, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks, Henry. I mean, following on directly from what Henry's saying, I'm going to focus in on one aspect of the report that we're producing at the moment that will be released between now and the end of the year. We're likely to do it in three parts, actually. One part will be about how the game is organised and run. Another part will be a whole range of proposals that the Alliance has brought together, different kinds of ideas. But the important thing that holds it together is the recognition that football is a partnership. It's about supporters, it's about communities, it's about players, it's about people involved in all different aspects of running clubs and so on. And really the question at the heart of governance that Henry mentioned is, why is it that we seem at the moment to be operating a kind of closed shop model rather than an open forum that brings the best talent, ideas and expertise into deciding how the game can be brought forward? So that's one of the things that we're really keen to promote. But there's a saying which a number of us will be familiar with, which is follow the money. And of course, the issue is, how is Scottish football financed? How do we bring more money into the game? How is that money used? What's it spent on? Who actually gets to decide that? When we talk about something like governance, it sounds abstract, but it's about who takes decisions. And we think there needs to be a broader base of decision making. But one of the elements of the report that we're producing is going to be a quite detailed proposal for independent arm's length scrutiny and, where appropriate, regulatory control of the way the game is financed and the way corporate governance operates in Scottish football. Now, this is something that's starting to be talked about across Europe. It's something that's also part of what's been happening down south. We'll hear more from Kevin in a moment. I think it's the beginning of a very important trend towards far more economic and financial accountability, responsibility and transparency in the game. And Scotland can not only join with others in Europe in moving in that direction, but it can actually take a lead here as well. Now, I mean, I'm not going to go into further detail at the moment, but just to say, you know, well, why is it necessary to think about that kind of maybe a regulatory framework and more independent scrutiny? And I should stress, we're not talking about government scrutiny, we're talking about arm's length and independent scrutiny. For example, in Scotland, Audit Scotland works with around about 20,000 bodies in receipt of public funds. So there are a variety of ways in which it can be done. And the reason it's important is because it's the public's money going in either directly or in some ways through government into the game. Yeah, the game is a national cultural industry. It has a massive public interest. So the public need to understand how it's run and how money is spent and so on. Very, very important. Also, there needs to be a framework in which we can have action over breaches of good financial conduct and so on. Now, I mean, there are all kinds of things in the game that work well, but there are some worrying things too. Questions sometimes might be asked about who gets to own and control clubs and how they got to own and control them. My own club, without going into too much detail, is at the moment partly owned offshore, partly owned by people in Norway who spend some of the time in Poland and who have as one of their chief advisors someone who's been struck off for being a company director for 12 years for various practices involving the demise of two major companies. And you might want to ask questions in that or many other instances as to, well, how did they get to be where they are? There needs, I think, to be more scrutiny, but also that's the case because we want to be able to bring more money into the game. That's absolutely vital. And you'll only do that with confidence, and you'll only get confidence if there's a framework that makes sure that that happens. And I think the really encouraging thing about that is that there are more and more voices saying that. Finally, what are the challenges in this kind of approach we're taking? Well, one is engaging the football authorities. When in 2017, we commissioned some highly expert German academics, sports and football academics, to do a survey into the governance of Scottish football, it was rubbished fairly instantly and quite unfairly, I think. So there's a kind of defensiveness there. We want to overcome that. We want to try and work in partnership, but we're not going to pull our punches or hide the issues because of that. I think the other thing is that, you know, whatever mechanism is developed, it will need to go through the Scottish Parliament. We're really keen to work on a cross-party basis. We're delighted to say that people in all the parties represented in the Scottish Parliament are behind the reform of Scottish football and looking at those kinds of issues. So I think it's really important that we try and do that in an open and honest way, that we avoid political games. We've had good conversations already preliminary-wise with the Scottish Government. We know that governments are a little bit hesitant to act, can can pull back when they should be doing more. Likewise, the politics of opposition can be, trying to show up the government in a bad light. We want to get out of political games and into the fact that there is an agreement in this kind of area and that it needs to move forward. My very final comment is, when we launched SFSA in 2015, we adopted the title and indeed we, believe in Scottish football. If we do believe in it, and we really believe in it, then we believe that change is possible. It's easy to be cynical, but I think there can be a really good future for the game in Scotland. But we have to grapple with some of those nitty-gritty and perhaps rather unsexy issues in order to look at who takes decisions, how money is spent, how we bring resources in, and how we rejuvenate our game. And that's what we're all about.
Superb. Thank you very much indeed, Simon Barrow there. And thank you also for all the questions coming in. John and Michael, we will answer some of those questions after we've heard from all the panelists today. So please keep them coming. Really good to get your engagement this afternoon. As I said, we've got a fantastic panel, so do make the most, because I'm going to welcome on Craig Brown now. And Craig, we want to hear your thoughts on what you've heard so far, but also in general, what do you make of the notion itself in changing the game in Scotland?
Heather, what I've heard so far from these two gentlemen, from Henry and from Simon, has been absolutely outstanding. I can't possibly compete with what they've said. I can only endorse what they've said, because everything I've heard this afternoon has been outstanding. And I've got to say that, I've heard Henry before on many an occasion, and when I hear him talk about football, he is right on the ball. I've got to say that. He's written a couple of reports. They were absolutely excellent. So having complimented him, I can't better what he said. I can add to it, and I can put one or two other issues forward, which I'll do so. And Simon too, magnificent exposition there. So, I'm privileged to be sitting listening to them, to be honest. Now, my own feeling is this, that, and I think I said this to Henry the other day, that for success in football in Scotland, we want the national team to be successful. And if the national team is successful, it promotes the game unbelievably well. And the best lecture I heard in all the years I was working at the SFA was from a rugby coach. There was a guy called Jeff Cook, who was coach of the England rugby team and, of course, the British Lions as well. And he made a very valid point. He said that you can spend all the money you like trying to develop your sport. You can bring in all the experts from abroad if you like, and we've done that. We've brought in guys like Mark Votte from the Netherlands and others, Karl-Heinz Hedegaard from Germany. We brought them in my time and in Andy Roxburgh's time. But you can spend all the money you like, but if the national team is not successful, the game is in the doldrums. If the national team is successful, and you see what's happened recently, when Steve Clarke took us to the European Championship, the interest in the game immediately increased. And therefore, it would be easy then to get kids to go onto football courses. We used to run courses when I was at the SFA. And, if the national team wasn't doing well, there was a bit of lethargy, there was apathy, and the kids weren't as enthusiastic. Now, when the team was doing well there recently, the sale of replica strips increased. The interest in the game increased as well, and the whole thing took off. And I'm quite a wee bit disappointed, and I was very sorry for Steve and the team that we didn't get to the World Cup in Qatar, because had we gone there, I'm sure the interest would have been. You can have all the meetings you like, you can have all the brains of the game that you can call upon, but if your national team is not successful, it is not going to help the progress of the game. Now, that's an oversimplification, I know, but there are other things to do. And I should just say before I go on that there's one area in football where I think we are in the forefront, and that is in the development of disabled football. Now, I think, women's football is doing very well also. So that I'm looking particularly at the national team, and our club side's doing exceptionally well in Europe. Rangers recently and Celtic not so long ago do very, very well in Europe. But when you look at the other aspects, the inclusion of women's football, Our women's team did very well, and they're doing well at the moment. Our disabled football is taking off, and I think there are 70 teams. It's now power chair. It used to be wheelchair. It's now power chair football. And the SFA, to its great credit, has invested a lot of money in that. They've put money towards the development of disabled football. And I think that's understated too often. I mean, we all talk about how is the national team doing and how are our club sides doing in Europe. And we sometimes forget that there's a lot of great work going on for other people in Scotland, particularly, well, the women's game. And I am particularly interested in disabled game. And I think it is in the forefront in Europe, actually. We were ahead of England when we introduced the wheelchair football. That's about 20 years ago. And then Kevin Keegan suddenly latched onto it and they introduced it in England. So I've got to say that there are good things going on. And there are things that I hear from Henry and from Simon that we must be doing. And I'm sure we will get governance of this game and have a coordinated attempt to ensure that we get the best possible return from the great resources that we've got here in Scotland.
Craig Ryan, many thanks for that. Craig, going to come back to you, I'm sure, with a couple of questions at the end. So do stay there. Let's take a look at then what's been going on down in England, shall we? Because we want to know, are there lessons to be learned? How indeed might a regulator work, for example? And how did they get to where they are now? So let's welcome on Kevin Miles from the FSA.
Thanks, Heather, and good afternoon, everybody. I mean, it's very interesting listening to the description of the starting point for you in Scotland and the differences and yet the parallels that exist in England, because I think judging by your criteria of the performance of the national team and the success of the Premier League financially, that English football could be argued to be in a much healthier and stronger position, having got to the finals of the last Euros, the semi-final of the World Cup previously, the Premier League being the most successful in economic terms, at least, league in the world in terms of audiences and revenue. And then obviously the relative success of English clubs in European competition. And yet that review that we've undertaken of the governance of football in England was generated by a crisis in football, that even success at that level can introduce complacency in the governance structures and how the game is regulated and managed. It could also build into its foundations an unsustainability from the point of view of the position of clubs in their relationship with their supporters and their communities. And that very success can, if not checked and balanced, can result in a lack of or an erosion of the competitive basis of domestic competitions as well, where you have a smaller number of clubs, of bigger clubs, more successful clubs, building in to this financial distribution mechanisms and a guarantee of the perpetuation of their own dominance at the expense of the competitive basis of the whole of the league. Now, that was something that came about in England. It was one of the triggers for the launching of the fan-led review, was the creation of the European Super League and the greedy 6 big clubs in England, in the English Premier League, and their greed, their lust for a guaranteed perpetual participation in European competition, regardless of whether they'd earned it on the pitch in the previous season, which is one of the principles as far as fans were concerned. That was one of the triggers, and it provoked a crisis in English football, even at the Premier League. I was present at the meetings with the Premier League and the Prime Minister at the time of the European Super League, in which the Premier League were openly saying at that point, we have lost control of the big 6 of our big 6 clubs. We are the existence and the continuation of the Premier League itself, the big success story, is at risk. But actually, you can take back the history of the fan-led review of the governance of English football further than that. We wrote a paper in 2018 about the financial regulation of football, where we were concerned about the sustainability of football clubs further down the pyramid. We did that in 2018. We took it to the FA, to the legal authorities at that point, and said, we think this is what you need to do to strengthen your own regulation. We got very little response to that, very little interest in taking that up. And yet in October 2019, we had the crisis at Bury Football Club with Bury going out of business. And that was enough to trigger government interest because it had a devastating effect on a local community. It was back in October 2019 that we first put that paper to government, and government came up with the idea of a review of the governance of football to look into how could further buries be prevented. 2019, December 2019, of course, saw the general election, where the fan-led review of the governance of football became a manifesto commitment. Boris Johnson was a re-elected Prime Minister. It was one of their manifesto promises, but it sat on the shelf for a bit. And it took the European Super League threat to actually bring it to the foreground and give it a certain amount of urgency. We've had the review. It has been an exhaustive and exhausting process, but we heard 130 hours of evidence of oral submissions, of over 100 hours of which came from supporter organisations. And while I know I'm vulnerable to the charge of you would say this, wouldn't you? I have to reiterate, and I do in every forum I get the chance, and I'm absolutely confident this will also apply in Scotland. But the contribution of supporters to that review was absolutely outstanding, both in terms of the passion that they brought to it, in terms of the stories that they had to tell about how supporters in so many cases had been the only people who kept clubs alive when they run into crisis, but also in the clarity of the solutions that were put forward, that we have among the supporters base in football an extremely knowledgeable and well-equipped group of people, because it reflects all walks of life, it has roots in all sections of society. The expertise that we were able to bring to bear through supporter submissions in the course of that process left me more convinced than ever that if you put the running of the game into the hands of supporters, or at least give supporters a significant voice in all the structures of the game, you will be investing wisely in terms of the structure and the future and sustainability of the game, because in supporters, you have people with a huge interest, but not a personal vested interest in the future of the game. And they have a wisdom and experience that goes with it. And I think that's one of the things that came out of the review, is a clear understanding that there needs to be a voice for supporters, a collective voice for supporters at every layer of the game. And that's where we get, I won't go into detail about it now, if there's interest, I can certainly explain more about it, but the idea of a golden share at every club, which guarantees the supporters a right of veto or consent over things like changing the name, changing the playing colours, but we also add into that process a relocation of your football ground, and on the basis of the European Super League, determining which competitions your club would take part in, participate in. There would be shadow boards in every club made up of supporters, which will give supporters multi-level engagement. So we're often talking about with supporter input in the club. All supporters are interested in is the next signing, the formation that the manager's playing, when can they get the manager sacked, and how hot are the pies. And clearly there is supporter interest far in all of those issues, not least the pies, but much more than that, about the strategic direction of football clubs, how they relate to their communities, their sustainability, how they can have a realistic future in front of them. We want to give supporters a voice at that level as well, and of course in all of the structures of the governance of the game. But the clear conclusion that the review came to, which is, if you like, the political hot potato now, is that it was absolutely clear, and it was supported across the whole of the advisory panel that we took part in, was a clear regulation, requirement for a statutory independent regulator for the game. In other words, that there was an acceptance that the football authorities could not be relied upon to regulate the game. In effect, you have leagues which are run by their member clubs setting the rules for the conduct of member clubs, and that cannot be right, asking the football clubs to mark their own homework, if you like, in terms of how they regulate in the game. And it has left the authorities powerless to deal with some of the issues about cost control, about sustainability, about the undermining the competitive base of the leagues. and the idea that there needs to be independent statutory regulation. Now, that was the first of 10 strategic recommendations that came out of the review. We're at the stage now where the government has published its response to those recommendations and has recorded for each one of those 10 either acceptance or support for every one of the recommendations. So that's a distinction between acceptance and support that I was completely unaware of before this process started. But apparently, if they accept something, it means yes, great, crack on and do it. If they support it, it means somebody else should crack on and do it, or they need to have a look at more detail of how they actually go about the process of doing it themselves. So we're at the stage now where, having given that general broad-based support to the recommendations of the review, there is a white paper to be published in which there'll be a consultation, and then there will need to be primary legislation tabled in Parliament. And that's where it starts to become much more mystifying for your average football fan, I think, because I defy anybody, it might be clearer in Scotland, but I defy anybody south of the border to tell you who's going to be in government, who's going to be the Prime Minister this time tomorrow, let alone by the time the legislation appears in Parliament. And these things are not insignificant. But we do have a position where the existing Conservative government have given their commitment to the introduction of statutory independent regulation. And that, to me, says something, because that is not a party which instinctively lends itself to greater statutory regulation and state involvement in the regulation of the industry. So there must be something wrong with the existing structures for a Conservative government to be doing that. The main opposition party south of all, the Labour Party, has given its support for what the way they phrased it was the full implementation in full of the Crouch report. In other words, just throwing their weight behind the whole of those recommendations. So we now have a process where we're politicians and we try to influence as best we can and speed them up as best we can. There's a certain tension between wanting things done quickly, but you want them done right and sustainably as well at the same time. But we think that it's going to require that sort of level of intervention in English football, because we are dealing with a lot of vested interests, a lot of people with money. It was fascinating. I'll finish on this. It was fascinating hearing the contributions in the course of the fan-led review. I've mentioned about the supporter input, the quality of it, and the unanimity of it in terms of the political conclusions. We also heard evidence from everybody else you could think of in football, including the big 6 clubs who were breaking away. These were confidential hearings, so people to speak frankly, and I can't, obviously, because it was confidential, I can't give too many secrets away, but let me say there was an incredible level of lack of self-awareness, of lack of any repentance about what they'd done. It was much more a question of, we're going to have to regroup and come at this again. And that, for me, just underlines every couple of months that goes by now, there is a new proposal in one form or another. I don't know if people have seen the latest one, the Dutch proposal for an EU-based European League, which obviously would exclude England and Scotland for political reasons rather than football ones. But that threat of the undermining of the competitive basis of domestic football and domestic leagues, of sacrificing everything to the needs of the elite clubs, that threat has not gone away. And I think it leaves the urgency. Now, whether you're in a position in Scotland for the football authorities to step up the mark and protect the game themselves, or whether you also need to have some sort of statutory independent regulation, that's an issue I'm not quite across in as much detail as I am south of the border, having lived and breathed this for years. But I have no doubt at all, listening to this panel, that we have assembled, you have assembled here, and in your alliance, the people who are perfectly capable of making that judgment, but also of getting it put into effect in an effective and sustainable way.
Fantastic. Thanks so much indeed to Kevin there. Really interesting, Kevin, to hear what you've said today, particularly the significance of fans and their role on this entire journey. Do keep your questions coming in, everyone. Thanks very much indeed to everyone so far who's put them in. We've got quite a few now, so I'll aim to get to as many as possible after our panelists have concluded. I want to welcome on now, though, someone who's been at the forefront of a fans movement, if that's what you want to call it, in the Foundation of Hearts. So first met Ian Murray, MP, when Hearts went into administration back in 2013. He is a passionate supporter of the game, and I'm sure that he will give good insight into how the review of the game might work, and indeed, if he believes that there is indeed a need for change. So let's welcome on, please, Ian Murray, MP.
Yeah, thank you, Heather, and thanks very much the SFSA for not only inviting me to make a contribution this afternoon, but for all the work that they've done. And it was fascinating there listening to Kevin and what's been happening in England with the English review, because the two things that fell from that, from my perspective of the opposition benches, was that the government were pretty much dragged kicking and screaming to make that commitment in their manifesto, and it was only in the shock of the European Super League breakaway and the fans' revulsion to that pushed them into doing the review. And I think the Crouch review is pretty extensive, and to get that onto the statute book. One thing I would say to Kevin, though, in terms of a statutory independent regulator and the fact that he's surprised that a Conservative government would bring that forward, I think the key challenge for all of us will be what those regulations actually say, and whether the independent regulator actually will have any teeth, and whether it will make any difference whatsoever. And the perspective I come to this is from the perspective of the fans. When I was doing the Foundation of Hearts nearly 10 years ago now, the whole governance in Scottish football seemed to be the supporters in a constant conflict and battle with the governance and the authorities. It wasn't as if the fans were the lifeblood of the game and were the customers of the game. It seemed to me that the governance, the authorities, the clubs and the fans were all completely and utterly disjointed, and it was survival of the fittest. And if you look at any other industry, can you imagine, I don't know, Marks and Spencer's or Facebook essentially alienating their loyal customers and telling them that they don't want to hear their voice? They want their Marks and Spencer stores open on a Saturday at least 10 till 2, but they're going to open them 7 till 9. They want things to be of a price that is affordable, but they're going to make the prices treble what is affordable. And they're only going to let in the television cameras for a portion of the time that they sell their goods in Marks and Spencer's. They would have been shut a long time ago, because most of the corporate world and most of the business world is driven by the needs of the customers. But in football, it seems to be the other way around, that the fans are taken for granted. They're seen as being a key component of the game, but one that's dispensable. And why? Because the money, the influence of the elite clubs, the broadcasters, and that money that goes into the game is much more powerful than the voice of the fans itself. But we have to find a way of not changing that balance, but actually of turning it into a much greater partnership. And I think the SFSA have got a real opportunity to do that. Now, Craig and Henry and others have been around Hampden a lot longer than I have in my experience of it. But my own experience of that, when trying to get Hearts out of administration, they were within hours of dying. The club was going to be the next third Lanark. They were going, and they were going to join, the Burries of this world. And I couldn't get the authorities and the governance of the game to recognise that fact, because they were of the view that if a club goes down and disappears, that's the responsibility of that club, and the rest of Scottish football will just move on regardless. Now, that's a very extreme example of one of our elite clubs that were in trouble, but actually it happens all the way down the pyramid. I've got some of the best youth football clubs and young football clubs in Scotland where 800 kids, male, female, 6-year-olds, 18-year-olds are playing every single weekend, and they struggle with that battle with the authorities as well in terms of how to grow the game. So there's no trust in all the different levels of the game, and that trust has to start at the very top. And that's why the changes of governance in football are really, really important. Now, an independent regulator may work, but would an independent regulator, for example, have stopped the takeover of Newcastle by the Saudis? Are they fit and proper people? Are they fit and proper individuals? They probably are. Should we allow geopolitics to get involved in football? Maybe it should be a key part of football, because it's a great influencer in our communities and a great way of connecting people together. So that proper reform of the game is well overdue. What that reform looks like is the challenge of the SFSA and the challenge of the governing bodies and the challenge of the fans to be able to articulate what it means. But it must be much bigger than the game, and it's got to take a long, hard look at why Craig was the last manager to take us to the World Cup, why, you know, it was great to go to the European Championships last year, but we were fortunate to get there. We did incredibly well to get there, and we've done incredibly well since, but let's hope it's not a one-off. But that is in despite of the governance of the game, not as a result of the governance of the game. And we should be using these great moments of national celebration in our game as the catalyst for changing it, to try and make sure that we can build upon that and go to major championships in the future. So my whole ethos of getting involved in football is obviously because I love the game, but the fans just get treated as if they are dispensable commodities in what has become a game run for the financial benefits of it. Now, I can understand why it's slightly like that in Scotland, because every pound's a prisoner. I mean, there's lots of money flushing around the game in England. Maybe it's not flushing to the right places, and that's part of the review, but there's not really an awful lot of money flushing around Scottish football. And that in itself shows you there's a problem in terms of the governance of the game and how we attract money into a much more desirable proposition. And that's run by the elite clubs. There is no doubt about that. But it's true when Kevin says that you can't have a situation whereby the member clubs of the member organisations therefore dictate the game, because vested interests will be all over this. And you've seen that with COVID. You know, still complain about Hearts being relegated, but Hearts were relegated not on the basis that they deserve to be relegated, perhaps they did, but on the basis of all the vested interests of the votes that were required from the other member clubs of that. Rangers are another case in point. So you can't really have clubs voting on their own rules, and you can't have a governance and a governing bodies who decide that they will just wash their hands of that kind of environment. So really excited to see what the SFSA come up with. I think what we've suffered from in Scotland for too long is proper reform. We've always done it this way, so we'll always continue to do it this way. And one of the key conclusions of my time at Hearts and with the foundation of Hearts is people who get involved in the game are desperate to change it until they go up that slippery slope. And then they get halfway up the slippery slope and they decide that actually the blazer is quite nice after all, and we will just keep defending what we've always defended. And that's the kind of attitude we need to get out of. It happens in a lot of walks of lives, and it happens in individual clubs right through the pyramid, but mainly at the governance of the game. And we need to try and find a way of breaking all that down. I wish I had the answers to it, but at least the SFSA are trying to find those answers, and I'll do everything I possibly can politically to pull politicians together of all colours to try and sort this out, because in Scotland and in England and in many, many parts of the world, football is the currency of community, and without football we don't have community, and we need to defend that and be custodians of the game forevermore. Otherwise we'll regret having a much diminished national sport.
Very well said there. Thank you very much indeed to Ian. And I remember the day very, very vividly when I got rallied to go and cover the Hearts story, the day that I think it was Hearts put 15 players up for sale, and you'll probably remember that day because I think we spoke a couple of hours later. And then that started, of course, what became the horrific time for Hearts going into administration, awful time for the club back in 2013. And all credit to you, Ian, and the rest of the team at the Foundation of Hearts for what you've achieved with the club since then. You really deserve that credit because it's been quite phenomenal. Okay, so we've looked then at the lessons to be learned from England. We've also looked at what good governance might look like, what restructuring might benefit the game in Scotland, among other things. Shall we take a look then at some of the questions coming in for the panel? So I don't know who wants to answer this one, but thank you, John. John got this one in pretty early. Most fans and former players, he said, I've spoken to believe that playing each other minimum 4 times per season plus cup ties and playoffs is monotonous. He would like to see an increased league size. Unfortunately, the TV demands of 4 Celtic versus Rangers matches and an over-reliance from the top flight on income from home matches against those clubs is preventing change, in my opinion. What are the panelists' thoughts on their ideal league structure? Who would like to answer that? You can just put your hand up or you can just come in.
I'll just say one sentence, Heather. I think league structures are important, but I don't think it's the root of the problem.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that one?
Heather, I would tend to agree with the chap who gave you the question, because I think there is a case for changing the league structure. I was involved, I was assistant manager at Motherwell when there were 18 teams in the league, and it was to be reduced to 10. And the top 10 went in. We get in on 9th place, I remember, by the skin of our teeth. Then initially it was it was 10. Then they realised the folly of their ways, I think, and they increased it to 12. And at the present time, it's 12. I genuinely think we would see more young players getting the opportunity if the league were extended to 16. And you could have the same number in the second division, or the championship, as they call it. Now, that's a personal opinion. It's not the opinion necessarily of the club that I represent, Aberdeen, but that's my feeling. And I genuinely think we'd get more development of young players with a bigger league.
Yeah.
Heather,
if I
sorry,
could,
Simon, you come in. Who would like to come in? Whoever wants to come in, please come in.
Heather. Yeah, Heather, if I can say a few words on that. I mean, I think I tend to agree with Ian that it is not the most important issue facing the game, but it comes back to this issue that let's take the Deloitte fiasco, which happened recently with 5 clubs suggesting that they create a kind of a American type setup for entry and permanent entry in that smaller Premier League. But again, it comes back to the issue that the fans don't have a say in any of this. I mean, it's the fans that, are customers. They go every week. The fans, for example, if you take my visits to Bayview to watch East 5, the fans are bored with watching the same teams, with that 10 in the league. So there is a case for change. And whilst I think Ian's right in saying that it's not the most important issue, it may be a longer term issue. But again, it comes back to the fact that here we can have a situation where a very few clubs decided in their own narrow, selfish interests to have a so-called Deloitte commissioned report to look into the game for their benefit, the few and the many again. And it seems to me that if we had a proper structure to the governance of the game, the fans may themselves not think it's the most important issue, but at least if it ever arose as an issue, they would be able to participate and give their views, which I think is at the heart of what we're talking about this afternoon.
Great stuff. Thanks very much indeed, Henry. Okay, we've got a question emailed in from Colin. Thank you, Colin. To all the clubs who do not do cash turnstiles on match day, but only sell online up until the day before the match, is this not depriving themselves of extra revenue? Why not maximize the business opportunity? That's to the panel. And if someone wants to come on, would you like to raise your hand, Simon?
I'll come in on that one. And I actually had a conversation with someone about this recently, and you're not going to like the answer, I'll tell you. The answer is, well, I mean, first of all, it is true that having online facilities opens access up. And what happens is people see the game, they book, they're more likely to attend because of that. A lot of people who don't have season tickets or don't buy online but turn up at the gate make those decisions fairly late. And so there's a kind of sense that, well, people book online, that means they're more likely to come. But even if they don't come, the club still gets the money. And if, on the other hand, some of those clubs who are doing that, well, you can buy it on the gate as well. People say, well, I won't bother to book online. I'll decide on the day whether I want to go. And then they don't go in the end. Then the club loses that revenue. Now, it's a difficult question. I think one of the things we need to understand is that the clubs are small businesses. Actually, it would help a lot more if we looked at it in those kind of terms. And some of the decisions they have to make are quite tough. One of the other questions is about why there isn't a flat rate for entry into all games. And the difficulty is that the economic size of different clubs is very substantially different. The issue there is bringing more money into the game and actually redistributing it more fairly so that clubs can take better decisions about that. But that's why people take very pragmatic decisions along those lines. And while I'm here, if I can just comment on the previous one, because it's worth saying that one of our members, Alistair Galloway, did produce what was called a fans plan on actually larger leagues, which also looked at the financial change that would be necessary to make that work. And some of us may remember that when the football authorities went down from 3 bodies to 2 bodies, there was actually a proposal on the table that something like that should happen, but it got shut out as soon as that change was mentioned. And it is something in our surveys that supporters again and again raise. And it's to do, of course, with the competitiveness of the game. And if the game is more competitive, it will be more attractive. So I think we need to look at these issues in a wider framework.
Perfect. Thank you to Simon there. This is one from Ian Emerson. Ian, who's the editor of the famous Tartan Army magazine. Thank you, Ian. Great to have you here. And he says, regarding the voice of the fans being listened to, how do the SFSA feel they have been met by the Scottish football authorities? Has there been resistance, or have there been positive steps made? I'm sure all of you would like to come in on this one. Andy, would you like to have a word on this, or Henry?
I'll come in first. I've probably been more involved in it. And Ian, I was just sending you a letter. We have met a couple of times in the last year, and there's a good dialogue between Stuart, our CEO, and both Ian Maxwell and Neil Doncaster. But I think that's being polite rather than saying that we're making real progress, because what the SFSA, and I suspect other fans, want is more radical change than people who are just running club-led organizations can either give or even facilitate. So we have a dialogue, it's healthy, but when we ask for change, it's because we can see the wood from the trees. And as I said, when I introduced everybody, when you put fans around a table together, we can agree on things that may not be the best for our clubs. But when you have both the SFA run for the good of its members, as long as you're not below the Lowland League, or when you have the SPFL run by its 42 clubs, and if you're below that, then they don't think that you're important at all, then the last thing they want is fans saying, hang on, guys, let's do everything fairly. Let's think about the lower clubs in the communities rather than just the 2 or 3 clubs who actually control everything. And after a year of trying hard to get close, I would say we are getting closer, but we're not close enough because fans aren't part of the picture yet. Over to Henry now, we'll talk about the Scottish Football Alliance, because Scottish Football Alliance is quite unique. Everybody is welcome. The SFA are welcome, the SPFL are welcome. Everyone who is casual fans are welcome. Fans every week are welcome. Everyone has input. It's everybody's business. Henry, over to you.
Heather, I think it was Simon that referred earlier to, to the closed shop. I mean, Hampden is a closed shop. We try and act as an organisation with ideas to help the game, but we're not seen as a critical friend. We're often seen as a critical enemy. And the tragedy of that is that when you circle the wagons, this is often not from a position of strength. It's actually a position of insecurity, and in my view, weakness. So we have constantly addressed the authorities by saying, of course we want change, of course we would like partnership, but as your questioner probably knew before he asked the question, not a great deal is happening. And Andy is quite right to say that there have been improvements recently in the dialogue, but of course we have to measure progress in actions, not in the number of times that we do meet. And that's why I believe that identity becomes important. I've always thought, especially when I was doing the reviews, that the most important organisation in Scottish football should be the SFA. And the reason for that is simply that it can help the clubs, but it can also take ownership and be the custodians of the national game, male and female, at every particular age group. And I think the key problem about the governance is that we have a situation where after the Scottish Football League disappeared, the Scottish Professional Football Association came into being. In the SFA, there was 2. But what we've seen is a migration of influence from the Scottish Premier to the Scottish Professional Football Association to the Scottish Football Association. And now I feel there's no identity that the SFA currently has. And what you've got is a few clubs dictating the actions of all the clubs. And I think if we're ever to break down and to be listened to, then we've got to get some progress on that particular matter. So yes, we keep knocking at the door. Yes, Andy's been doing a good job in discussions and dialogue. But I would pose this question to the football authorities. We merely want to help. We want to make sure that we don't have to wait a quarter of a century to qualify or more for performances on the international stage. We want the clubs to be listened to, even the most humble clubs at the bottom of the divisions or even with the divisions. The fans are the game. I wouldn't go as far as Shankly to say it's more important than life or death, but actually We get a lot of money from the television side of it. The investment's huge and beneficial. But we mustn't forget that a significant part of the income comes from the fans. And some fans will tell you that they think they're being treated like in a medieval age, you know, where they go through clunky turnstiles. You maybe can't organize online. So the game's horizon should be significant. And all I think we're arguing for the authorities is, look, join us, or we would like to join you. It's for the betterment of the whole game, betterment for individuals, and I believe at the end of the day for the success of individual clubs, whether in Europe or the national side on the world stage.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed to Andy and Henry there. So this is one from an anonymous attendee, and they say, out of all change possible, what is the one thing that could trigger it? Who would like to answer that? And if you could put your hand up, that'd be great.
Well, Heather, I'll be very, very brief. In all the change that I've seen in football, particularly at Hearts, it was crisis that changed it. And I think Scottish football isn't in crisis at the moment. It has been in the past, and no doubt will be in the future. But so I think these kinds of issues would be best addressed when we're not in crisis rather than when we get there, because if it's done on a backdrop of crisis, then the right decisions will not be made. So my plea from what Henry's just said and what Andy said previous to him, in terms of the engagement of trying to help develop the game, let's do it now. Otherwise, when crisis does hit, it becomes a much more difficult thing to achieve.
Great stuff. And actually, this might be just a follow up for you. I'm just going to do a couple more questions, by the way, before we wrap up. Patrick, thank you for your input today. This one is for you, Ian. So just while you're there, he says one way to change the culture of the SFA that worked well in an IT department that he once worked in at quite a high level, that he managed, is to view the SFA as providers of services to clubs or fans, and the club's fans treated as customers who have a say in the quality of the service provided. Levels of service for the SFA to meet are agreed and assessed by the users of the service, not the providers. It is normal practice now, normal business practice indeed. Would it be an approach to consider to bring about cultural change, he says?
It's a great question, isn't it? Unfortunately, the problem with that model, in terms of that transactional model, is that there's a little thing called trying to win games on the pitch, and that tends to upset the transactional model in that sense. But yes, I mean, I suppose to a certain extent the governing bodies do already have the targets that they set themselves and that the fans want to see, and that's qualifying for major championships, making sure the game's well funded, etc., etc. You do have to find a model that allows fans to be at the heart of that and to be working in partnership with it rather than being in conflict to it. And he's absolutely right. I do like the question, Patrick, and it's something that I'm sure the SFSA will look at as well. But the problem with an IT government department and the SFA, if you like, is somebody's got to start scoring goals and winning games.
Just let Simon come in there, Simon.
Yeah, just to come in on that, because it's a really important thing. There's a sense in which football is a business like other businesses, but is not a business like other businesses. Ian has highlighted that. There are all kinds of ways in which fans don't want to be treated as customers. I mean, remember on transport, we've been shifted from being passengers to being customers. And that means we're dealt with the statistics and in terms of financial inputs and so on, doesn't always produce better service. Having said that, our friends in Germany, for example, where we have lots of other good things like the 50-50 rule on ownership and so on, actually have got a model with a number of clubs where on a very regular basis, fans are consulted, involved on the service provision element. So there are ways in which that can be done. But going back to the previous questioner who was asking about, you know, what's the thing that will shift the gear, if you like, there isn't a silver bullet. But yes, I mean, I've already said, I think that the nitty-gritty issues of finance and governance are the ones around a lot of which this will revolve, and they will be the difficult ones because who decides and who pays becomes a really critical issue. But there's also a need for a kind of mindset change, if you like. I mean, really, the health of any one club, and that even applies to our two big clubs, you know, who are struggling in Europe because they don't have enough competition locally. In other words, their health in the future depends on the health of the whole game. All clubs depend not just on their own health, but the health of the whole game. And we have to find ways of investing more broadly in that game. In fact, one of the former managers of one of the two leading clubs at a press conference, probably from his club's point of view, rather tactlessly said, well, maybe if we had a little bit money, but it was spread out more evenly across the game, it in the long run would enable us to do better. That's absolutely right. That kind of mindset change is really, really important. But then we have to get down to the gutsy issues.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. So this is an interesting one, and I'm actually going to get you all involved in a bit of this, and you can take your time, because I'm only going to ask one more question after this one. So thank you, David. David McMillan, he says, can I ask the panel a simple but serious question? Where would football be without the thousands of volunteers week in and week out? And how can the volunteers be supported? I'm going to get every single one of you to answer. I'm just going to put my screen to dark, and I'm just going to let you come in one after the other, and you can take your time on this one, okay? And I'll be right back with you. So I'm going to start off with Craig, because Craig, I know you've been in the game for a very long time, and I know how important to you volunteers are.
Yes, very, very important. And I think particularly the lesser clubs, the clubs not at the Premier League, depend almost entirely on the volunteer efforts of supporters. And I should say at the top level, something's never been mentioned here, which I think is very important in this context. Every club has a supporter liaison officer, and that's an appointment. And that supporter liaison officer, you know, at Hearts, I think, is it Mark Watterson? Am I right in saying? I'm trying to remember the name. John Paul Taylor at Celtic. We have a lady at Lynn Fisk at Aberdeen, and there are 3 or 4 ladies who are supporter liaison officers. They depend almost entirely on the help of volunteers. And I think we cannot ignore the contribution made by volunteers in football. I also think that the SLO, or they're called the supporter liaison officer, should be consulted. There should be a committee of them. There are committees at the SFA. You've got a disciplinary committee, you have a coaching committee, you have an international committee, you've got various committees. I think a good, a very desirable other committee would be a supporters committee. And the supporter liaison officer in each club, they would have an election and they would nominate a small committee or a small group, or even an individual, to sit on the SFA council to give the supporters' opinions. And these supporters' opinions, I'm sure, would include the necessity or the desirability to have a great help from volunteers. So I would never minimise the contribution of volunteers in football, because they're the lifeblood of the game at the lower level. And of course, they're a bonus to the game at the top level. So without doubt, a very, very valuable contribution will be made by volunteers.
Yeah, very, very important. Just to follow on from that, completely agree, particularly for smaller clubs. On the non-football side, often smaller clubs can only actually afford to employ 1 or a couple of people to do some pretty essential tasks. And they are hugely dependent on the network of volunteers to make the whole thing work, not just on the match day, but throughout the week and throughout the year as well. And I think making sure that volunteers are actually valued and recognised, and that the club does what it can, if it's not able to pay people, to reward them for what they do, is really, really important. Also, you need structures to ensure that the management of volunteers is handled well, that people are accountable for what they do, as well as being recognised and rewarded for what they do. And my last comment is, it is important, particularly hopefully as a local club within its community can begin to grow, that volunteers aren't simply used as a cheap way of doing things that we now don't have to pay for. So whilst I think volunteer help is really important, there are ways in which people should be paid expenses, and people should be paid more than expenses. Same as the issue in other industries with internships, trying to get people to do stuff on the cheap. Now, I mean, football is different to that, because a lot of fans actually actively want to give their time and are able to do so. But I'm just saying that we need to look at the financial framework and make sure that people aren't exploited, but rather are valued.
Heather, if I can comment, I mean, I think this hits at the heart of the game, because in a sense, we've heard much talk that these are businesses, and that's absolutely right. We do live in, 2022, not 1922. But It also highlights, the social, the emotional, the cultural, the history, and if you look back, some of the clubs, most of the clubs, all of the clubs have tremendous records of being involved at the heart of the community. I know people, when I was doing politics in Central Fife, my constituency, you got more votes for being an Exees Fife player than you did for being a member of the Labour Party or any other party. And that was healthy, because a lot of those people in the early days saw it as some continuity. That was their community, that was their football team. And one of the things is about volunteers, they represent that part of the history of the club. Now they're being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And as the few at the top get more and more out of the Scottish pie, we should worry about that. And that's why I'd like to think, I always make the plea for Scottish football, that it's more than a business. I'm sorry, but it's more than a business. I don't want to be involved in nostalgia politics or nostalgia or delusion. But at the end of the day, a lot of clubs will never be in a cup final, never receive a cup, never play in Europe, never play for the national side. But the passion, the commitment, the pride, the history, we should continue to recognise that. And that's why I think one of the aspects of the SFSA is to remind those at Hampden that there is this tremendous legacy. And if they're not careful, they may cut that off. And to me, without that legacy, the game is not what it should be. It could be as modern as it wants, but at the end of the day, it is about people. And I think we ignore that at our peril.
Great stuff. Thank you very much to everybody there. If anyone wants to say anything more on that, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to go on to the final question from Walter. Thank you, Walter, about disabled supporters being treated like second-class citizens, as he puts it. He says when he was involved, there was a forum for all disabled supporters in the SDSA. That forum was fighting to get equal rights for disabled fans and was allowed to die. Not all clubs treat or recognise all disabled supporters equally. This has to stop. What are your viewpoints on this, chaps? I don't know who wants to go. You can put your hand up. Craig?
Yes, I would reinforce what I said about the supporter liaison officer. In the context of Aberdeen Football Club, the supporter liaison officer is also the disabled officer to look after the disabled supporters. And she is very, very diligent. She ensures that great provision is given to the disabled group. And in fact, they very often, and I'm in an ambassadorial role, I get complimented sometimes, they sent a message round asking what we would like at halftime amongst the disabled wheelchair supporters. And this, I think, is of great importance. And they come in good numbers and they get decent facility, they get good access. And before the halftime whistle, a request is taken from each of them for what they would like to refresh themselves at halftime. The response to that kindness and that thoughtfulness of the football club and of every football club who looks after disabled supporters is quite remarkable. And you feel really for them because they're so grateful for the help that they receive. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of catering for disabled footballers. For footballers, as I said earlier, as players, many in the wheelchairs, but also supporters who come to watch the game, and they must have a good provision in each club. I think that's essential.
Heather, the point that Craig has made, I mean, we can take it further because there's much talk about mental illness, about wellness, about mindfulness. There's a whole interest in physical health, mental health, all of that. And it seems to me that apart from the contribution that disabled football makes in action, this provision we make for disabled supporters at the games, we should put them in a wider context. Everybody should have a role in the game that we're talking about. And again, sorry to be kind of arch critic, but at times, those wider considerations are not part of the mainstream thinking of the football authorities. And if the SFA has one task, it's to make sure that we are inclusive. And as Craig says, that's inclusive in terms of playing the game or inclusive in terms of getting support and watching the game. So I think that, again, a lot of great stuff is being done by the clubs, but let's just be careful that in this kind of material well-being kind of society that we are in, that we don't lose all of these issues because they detract from the community, which in my view is a core facility of the game that we still hold on to.
Indeed, thank you very much indeed to Henry there. Well, a superb discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed to everyone for your participation. We do have more questions, and I'm really sorry we can't get around everyone today, but we will keep them and we will try and answer them in another way. So we will see what we can do on that front. But you know what, let's keep this conversation going. Please do support everyone at the SFSA and get your views across. You, the fans, are the ones that matter, and you are at the very heart of everything that we do in Scottish football. So don't forget that, and don't let this conversation die. Right, should we pass then back to our chairman, Andy Smith, to close today's event.
Thank you, Heather. Just to warn everyone, there are two final questions. They're both for Craig. And Craig, I'm getting my money's worth from you today, boy. The first one is schools football. Is that a no-brainer?
Well, it should be reinstated, I think, as enthusiastically as it was when I and people of my vintage were at school, because schools football was the lifeblood of football, and we didn't have to have any other youth clubs even, because the school teachers were enthusiastic and they were diligent. And I think when you look at the two players or people in Scotland who have held the European Cup, one is a player and one is a manager. The player was Billy McNeill. He played schools football in Motherwell from the age of 8 till he was 18. And he won the European Cup with Celtic as a player. The man who won it as a manager, Sir Alec Ferguson, played for Govan High School as a young boy right through the school. And if you speak to, well, obviously you can't speak to Billy, sadly, but if you speak to Alec, he will say to you, Sir Alec will tell you that football at school was the making of him. And he played for the Scotland schoolboys, and he's proud of that. In fact, if ever he should give me a talk, he always says, when I played for Scotland schoolboys, and he loved that. But he also is very, very quick to acknowledge the contribution of schools football towards the development of players when he was a manager in Scotland, when he managed his team, 3 teams in Scotland, at East Stirling, at St Mirren and at Aberdeen. He tapped into schools football endlessly to get players for his senior club. And he has the highest regard, as I do, for schools football.
Okay, and now the second question, because I think you'll have an insight in this as well. If we could do one smart thing to get this snowball rolling, one smart thing, what's the smartest thing that we could do?
You've asked me that one there. I think I might go back to the contribution that could be made by the SLO at each club.
I've frozen.
If they had a committee and they met, because they represent the supporters, and the importance Henry has outlined and had both in his talk today and in his written reports, the importance of finding what the supporters want. The supporters are the lifeblood of the game. And if you get the supporters on side and you get to feel and find what they desire and what they think is good for the game, that's the way forward, I think. Now, each club has an officer, a paid officer, to look after the supporters. Now, get them together, get the heads of the supporters there and ask them, how do you think we could improve the game for you? And I'm quite sure we might get something original. I'm not saying there is something original, but surely we will certainly some very, very good ideas from the people who pay their money to come and watch the football matches.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, just summing up now. Thanks to Simon, scintillating insight in the numbers, Simon, and look forward to your report. Thank you to Henry, insightful as always. Ian, big thanks. We're going to need your help because we're going to need your guidance. Kevin, I want to come and sit and spend a week with you and just learn. Thank you for the honesty, for the openness, and for the sheer energy that you can help us with. And finally, Craig, big thanks, huge thanks. You'll be part of this, and that's a huge, huge thank you. So, big round tables needed from Stranraer to Shetland. Everybody is welcome. We need to get a common good bedrock, because that's what football's based on. Just the big clubs have forgotten it. Success, guys, is everybody's business. And something from Ian is regulators need teeth. Thank you, everyone, for coming on today. Thank you. And this will all be on YouTube and available for everyone to look at. And maybe somebody will get a PhD, as this is the start of a big movement. Thank you, everyone.
Vote of thanks to the chair and Heather.
Thank you. Yes, we're here.
Many thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.